Professor Metzel, I know it's a very difficult question, but you are a professor of psychiatry. Does he prove to be a very unusual profile, this man, Stephen Paddock?
Well, certainly, there are two parts to that question. On one hand, there are profiles that particular mass shooters have. They're often white, middle-aged or upper middle-aged, disgruntled, people who have some kind of grudge to bear. And so in that sense, there's so much that we haven't learned yet about this shooter. But I'm guessing that as things progress and as we learn a bit more about the very difficult question of motive, which we may or may not ever know, that I think the demographic and the information about his particular history may or may not, but likely will fit into some patterns that we've seen. But I think that even as we ask this individual question about his psychology and motive, which is at the core of, I think, the question our nation is asking right now, which is, how could this have happened? There also is a larger structural question, which is, how can any one citizen amass what amounts to an arsenal that's almost like a small country, this level of automatic weaponry and factors like that? And so, in a way, I think that there are two levels to this question, which is on one hand about the individual motive, but then there's the larger question about, do we really want to make it as easy as it is for individual citizens to amass weapons, really weapons like this, whose only aim is to inflict mass casualty?
I mean, is it extremely unusual? I mean, we heard his brother there saying he just hung out. I mean, for him to have carried on doing and carried out that mass murder, is there something that breaks in people, or would he have planned that over a long time?
Well, you know, certainly there's much, much, much that we don't know about this particular case, and so I think that those will be the questions really that we're asking. But I think you're right in the thrust of your question, which is that it's clearly the case that a great deal of planning goes into an issue like this, into a crime like this. And in that sense, as a psychiatrist, I very often get asked, is this person mentally ill? Are they insane? Are they schizophrenic or severely depressed? And I would say that in a way, that's probably not going to be the case here, because this event really took a lot of planning, a lot of foresight, a lot of organizational capacity, and so it tends to steer more from a diagnostic perspective toward things we think of in terms of, first of all, like personality type disorders. So somebody had some type of sociopathic personality that they could commit cold mass murder. But again, it's hard to think of the psychology without the bigger context, the contextual story about guns in America, because every country has its own amount of people who are mentally imbalanced, but no country has the level of mass violence and mass shooting that we do here in the United States.
One more question, Professor. I know you were on National Public Radio in the States today talking about toxic masculinity. Talk about this. It's interesting in relation to this mass murderer.
Well, certainly there are frameworks, and you can't kind of avoid the fact that many of these mass shooters, as I was saying before, fit into a particular demographic of being often white men who have amassed particular kinds of guns. Now, we have a history in this country of treating mass shooters very differently depending on their backgrounds. And so if an African-American man commits a mass violent act, we say there's a problem with black culture. If it's somebody of Middle Eastern descent, we automatically say that it's a problem of terrorism. But we don't really have a language for the bigger story of what is it that causes white men to act this way, even though there are so many mass shootings that are caused by white men. And so we don't look just at mental illness, we also look at these questions of masculinity. And scholars of masculinity have looked at something called toxic masculinity, which is a sense basically that white men feel that they've lost some status, that something is owed to them, and often they take that out. You'll see, for example, that many mass shooters have a history of domestic violence. They take it out on their partners, on the world. And taken to the great extreme, it's this sense that kind of white masculinity is not just self-harming, it's harming because of this fallen status.
Professor, thank you. Dimitri, one very last quick question. Will this change the gun laws in the States or not?
At the federal level, I don't think it'll have any major significance. It may encourage people at the state level to force their local politicians to do something, and that's what the the gun control advocates hope will be something that happens in the US in the years to come.
Dimitri, thank you once again for joining us tonight, Professor, as well. David.